The land. That's the crux. That's the crux for Navy people, but that's actually the motive force that arrives in this. The analysis wouldn't lead you to conclude that people are getting on boats in Liverpool, in London, in Barcelona, and from wherever else they're coming for the express purpose of coming over and butchering Indians. Now, there may have been some psychopaths in the lot, usually are when you got a large number of people. There's the occasional psychopath who was motivated exactly that way, but that's the exception, not the rule. Exception proves the rule, and a rule that it proves is that the people getting on those boats were coming over because they were essentially left landless in the aristocratic regimes that had been imposed upon Europe that particular period of history. They weren't well treated, they weren't wealthy, they had aspirations. What they wanted was land. They came to get the land. They were told the land was vacant, kind of like the population of the 20th century was told the land was vacant, and guess what? When they got here, it wasn't. So if you're going to acquire the land, you got to get rid of that population. You've got to come up with a philosophical, theological rationalization of why it's right and proper you should do it. Manifest destiny as a doctrine, as it's touted in the United States, really doesn't congeal, doesn't become popular until 1840, which is pretty late in the game, but the antecedents run back all the way to Cotton Mather and the Pilgrim Fathers in their operations in the Plymouth Plantation, as they called it, present-day Massachusetts. The notion that they were coming in as a superior, chosen people, and as a chosen people had an inherent right to, for their own purposes, for their own uses, for their own benefit, ultimately for their own whim, to appropriate the property of those they proclaimed to be lesser mortals, usually on the basis of being infidels, but not always. Maybe they were just the wrong kind of Christians sometimes. These were Protestants that were coming in. They weren't too cordial to Catholics, and you had a lot of warfare between Catholic France and Protestant England. You had warfare between Protestant England and Catholic Spain as well. Ultimately, the Protestant ascendancy was clear in North America, but it wasn't always clear. Either way, irrespective of which group, but we're talking about Anglophones primarily, their sense was of being superior to anyone that didn't think like them, look like them, and desired to see the world transformed into something that they were comfortable with. In other words, what it was that they'd left. Hence, you end up with names like New England. I mean, excuse me, the area of Maine, in Vermont, and so on, isn't exactly England. England is a few thousand miles of open water away, but they're going to recreate England, the England from which, as despised groups, they were by and large being expelled from, on the ground where they encountered it. Well, that notion of being superior, however it's rationalized or conceived, and thus entitled to the real property of those you declare to be, by whatever definition of superiority you're applying to yourself, your inferiors, is the guts, if you will, of the doctrine of a manifest destiny. A destiny that's so self-evident and obvious, given the superiority of Anglophone culture operating in this hemisphere. Yeah, you can trace that back to the first moments. And you can trace back to the first moments the notion of the people who had provided them land and provided them. You all celebrate Thanksgiving, I would suppose, or aware of its celebration, at least in this country, and what it is that's being celebrated in Thanksgiving is the fact that the boat people, when they arrived with their superior culture, their superior tradition, their science, or whatever you wanted to use as markers in defining the superiority, couldn't figure out how to feed themselves. The squalid Stone Age hunter-gatherers had to bring them field crops to feed them one November when they were on the verge of starvation. Yeah? And they were already sitting down in council and figuring out how to appropriate the property of the people who were feeding them and keeping them alive and teaching them techniques of survival in this new world that they had encountered, that they had renamed in honor of themselves as New England. How does that play out? Well, the way you deal with vacant land that isn't vacant when you encounter it is evacuate the population. And that could be literally the case. They did try virtually everything. Like I said, there wasn't a pathological bent to exterminate necessarily. Extermination is an option, but they tried removing people, as they called it, relocating people, shoving people off the land, increasing the margins, usurping their economies and so forth, negotiating them into different status than they had previously occupied, and ultimately the greed, for lack of a better word, for land was such that these solutions ultimately couldn't work. There was a point in the late 1820s, implemented in the 1830s, when they decided the solution would be to empty all of North America, or U.S. portion of it, east of the Mississippi River, of its indigenous population. Literally round them up, put them in camps until it was time and things were organized, and then force march them to a point west of the Mississippi River. Totally evacuate the indigenous population, emptying the land, repopulating it with superior, well, we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but to all intents and purposes, what they call it was superior breeding stock, that is to say themselves. Now, those terms were quite literally used in the 20th century in Europe by a state that was modeling its policy of expansion on that of North American Aryans, Germanic peoples, whatever term you want to use. Yes, I can give you the references on that as well. They were copying Manifest Destiny policy as it was implemented in its refined form in the second half of the 20th century quite closely, knowingly, intentionally, adjusted for organizational forms that had emerged since the late 19th century, and particularly with regard to technological innovations that had occurred. You did have evolutions of technology that were not available in the 19th century or prior in order to do what they were setting out to do.